Flashing police lights lit up the empty highway as Chuck Norris pulled his car to a smooth stop on the shoulder. He kept calm, his hands resting clearly on the wheel, but the air grew heavy the moment two officers stepped out of their cruiser. One of them moved fast and aggressive, slamming his flashlight against the glass and barking orders like Chuck had already been convicted of a crime. The other officer hung back, uneasy but silent, letting his partner take control. Drivers passing by slowed, sensing something was wrong, their eyes drawn to the brewing confrontation. In that instant, it was clear this wasn't a routine stop, and what these cops were about to do would leave everyone speechless. Chuck lowered his window and greeted the officers with a steady voice, polite and respectful. He explained calmly that he was coming back from a late meeting and offered to provide his license and registration. His composure seemed to irritate the lead officer even more. With a smirk, the officer leaned closer and snapped that Chuck should keep his mouth shut and do exactly as he was told. The second officer circled the car, shining his flashlight into the back seat as if searching for something that wasn't there. Chuck stayed quiet, giving no reason for hostility. Yet every word from the officers dripped with arrogance and disdain. The aggressive officer ordered him out of the vehicle without explanation, mocking his calm demeanor as if it were an act of guilt. A small line of passing cars slowed, drivers glancing toward the scene. A few even raised their phones, recording what was quickly becoming more than a simple stop. The tension grew heavier by the second. What was supposed to be a routine check had turned into harassment, and for those watching, the stakes were painfully clear. Two men abusing their authority against one man who refused to lose his dignity. The lead officer dug into Chuck's car with exaggerated force, opening compartments and pulling at the seats as though he already knew what he was supposed to find. Papers and personal items were tossed carelessly to the ground, the flashlight beam darting from one corner to another. The second officer stood nearby, keeping a hand close to his belt, glaring at Chuck as if daring him to make the slightest wrong move. Then, with a smug grin, the first officer reached beneath the driver's seat and pulled out a small sealed bag. He raised it high in the air, his voice loud and triumphant as he declared it was drugs. The smirk on his face told the truth. This was no discovery, it was a setup. Chuck's expression hardened, though his body language stayed calm. His voice, steady and controlled, cut through the false accusations. He asked how it was possible that something appeared under his seat when moments before the car had been clean. The officer brushed off the question, circling him like a predator playing with prey. He mocked Chuck for daring to question authority, calling him a criminal who thought he could outsmart the law. The second officer laughed, adding that men like him always believed they were above the rules, but tonight he would learn otherwise. Chuck stood tall, his hands at his sides, refusing to react with anger. His calmness only made the officers more reckless. Drivers passing slowed their cars, some leaning out of windows to see what was happening. A few pulled over completely, phones raised, recording the escalating confrontation. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers. A woman whispered to her husband, asking if that was really Chuck Norris. Another man shook his head in disbelief, saying it couldn't be. The idea seemed impossible, yet the resemblance was undeniable. Still, the officers carried on with their charade, mocking him louder, parading the planted evidence as if the case was already closed. But Norris stayed calm, his steady silence radiating an energy that unsettled even those watching from the sidelines. He did not need to shout or resist. He let them believe their lie, his eyes fixed on them with quiet intensity. No one there could have known that beneath his restraint was a storm waiting to erupt. A storm that would soon turn the entire scene upside down. The lead officer suddenly shoved Chuck against the hood of his car, the metal echoing with a heavy thud. The second officer grabbed his arm, twisting it as though he were restraining a dangerous suspect. Chuck's jaw tightened, his calm finally breaking into words. His voice was firm but not raised, carrying more weight than a shout could. "I don't think you know what you're doing," he said, his tone steady, almost warning. The officers ignored him, pressing harder, trying to show dominance through force. Gasps rippled through the small crowd that had gathered on the roadside. The situation was no longer a misunderstanding. It was open abuse. People recording on their phones stepped closer, unable to believe what they were witnessing. Chuck Norris, a man known for discipline and strength, was being treated like a criminal on the side of the road, accused without proof and attacked without cause. The disbelief in their eyes quickly turned to outrage, but fear kept them from stepping forward. The lead officer sneered, accusing him again of carrying drugs, claiming this was evidence enough to put him away for years. His partner pressed his weight against Chuck's shoulder, forcing him lower as if trying to break not only his posture, but his spirit. Chuck's eyes flicked toward the crowd, then back to the officer holding him down. His expression was calm, but his voice cut through the night with quiet authority. "You're making a mistake you won't be able to take back." The imbalance of power was undeniable. Two armed officers towering over one unarmed man, using their authority as a shield for their corruption. The scene looked hopeless, tilted completely against Chuck. And yet the longer he stayed silent, the more suspense grew in the air. The crowd held its breath, wondering if he would fight back or endure the humiliation. Every second stretched thin, the tension building toward a breaking point that no one could predict. Pinned against the car, Chuck lifted his head slowly, his voice breaking through the noise of sirens and angry commands. "Are you done?" The words were calm, almost casual, but they carried a weight that made the officers pause for a moment. The lead officer tightened his grip, barking that Chuck should keep quiet, but the tone in Chuck's voice was different now. It wasn't the voice of a man cornered. It was the voice of a man who knew something they didn't. Chuck's right hand moved toward his jacket. Instantly, both officers tensed. Hands shot to their holsters, panic flashing across their faces. "Don't you move," the lead officer shouted, his voice cracking with a sudden edge of fear. Chuck ignored the threat, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The crowd gasped, several bystanders ducking slightly, expecting the worst. The silence that followed was heavier than the flashing lights, a moment where time seemed to stop. Then Chuck pulled his hand free. No weapon, no resistance. Just a polished badge glinting under the streetlights, a golden shield that gleamed with unmistakable authority. The three letters engraved on its surface were clear to everyone close enough to see. D. Chuck Norris was not just a man pulled over at random. He was a federal agent. For the first time that night, the officers' confidence shattered. Their mocking smirks fell away, replaced with the pale faces of men realizing the trap they had built was closing around themselves. The crowd erupted in murmurs, phones rising higher as people tried to capture every detail. "Did he just say D?" someone whispered. Another voice answered, trembling with awe. "They tried to plant drugs on a D agent." The officers stumbled backward, their hands trembling near their belts, unsure whether to holster their weapons or draw them. Chuck remained perfectly still, holding the badge out in front of him, his gaze locked on the men who moments earlier thought they had the upper hand. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to move a muscle. The silence spoke louder than anything else. And that's when the officers realized the man they framed was not a victim, not someone to be bullied into submission. He was the law itself. Chuck's voice cut through the chaos with razor-sharp clarity. "My name is Chuck Norris, senior agent with the D, currently assigned to investigate corruption in local law enforcement." His words echoed over the flashing lights, steady and controlled, leaving no space for argument. He held his badge firmly in the air, making sure every eye in the crowd and every camera recording caught the truth. The officers who just moments earlier barked orders and shoved him around now looked like their souls had been ripped out. Their faces drained of color, hands trembling, eyes darting nervously between each other and the badge glinting in the night. The one who had mocked him froze completely, his mouth opening slightly as if to speak, but no words came. Fear had stolen his voice. Chuck didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply spoke, each sentence like a hammer striking down on their fragile confidence. "I've been tracking cases exactly like this," he said, his tone cold and precise. "Officers abusing their power, planting evidence, destroying lives. Tonight I finally caught you in the act." His words carried across the street, and the crowd reacted instantly. A wave of murmurs broke out, whispers flying in every direction. They planted drugs on a D agent, someone said, disbelief turning into outrage. "This is over for them." Another voice added, phone still raised, recording every second. The power dynamic shifted like a sudden storm. Just minutes ago, the officers had all the control, barking threats, laughing at their target. Now it was Chuck who commanded the street without raising his voice. The crowd's energy surged in his favor, people stepping closer, emboldened by the truth. The officers, once so eager to humiliate him, stood paralyzed, every eye on them, every lens capturing their downfall. Chuck's presence was immovable, like a wall they couldn't break through. The silence between his words crushed them harder than any physical force could. The air was thick with judgment, and they could feel the ground slipping away beneath their boots. For the first time, the predators had become the prey. Just when the tension seemed unbearable, the sound of more sirens filled the street. Backup units rolled in, lights flashing, doors flying open. For a moment, the corrupt officers looked hopeful, thinking their reinforcements had arrived to save them. But that illusion shattered instantly. The first officer out of the car caught sight of Chuck's badge, his posture snapping straight. He raised a hand in salute. "Agent Norris," he said firmly, loud enough for everyone to hear. One by one, the new arrivals followed suit, showing respect. The crowd gasped as the truth became undeniable. These men hadn't just harassed an innocent man. They had humiliated a senior D agent. Their careers were already crumbling before their eyes. The commanding officer gave a sharp nod, and within seconds the corrupt cops were disarmed and shoved against the very car they had tried to frame. Their wrists clicked into handcuffs, locked by the hands of their own colleagues. The disbelief on their faces was almost pitiful, but the crowd wasn't sympathetic. Phones recorded every humiliating second as the officers who once strutted with arrogance now stood exposed, powerless and chained. Chuck turned away from them and toward the gathering of bystanders. His expression softened, his voice carrying steady reassurance. "Justice still exists," he told them calmly. "No one is above the law, not even those sworn to uphold it." His words cut through the night, grounding the shaken witnesses who had feared what they saw would go unanswered. Some in the crowd cheered, others simply let out breaths they'd been holding. The emotional release swept over them, the heavy weight of injustice finally lifting. Where fear had ruled moments ago, relief now spread. Chuck's presence had reversed the nightmare before their eyes, reminding them that power abused can still be stripped away. The balance had been restored. With the situation under control and the dirty cops taken into custody, Chuck slipped his badge back into his jacket. The flashing lights still painted the street in red and blue, but his calm presence cut through the chaos. He walked to his car with steady steps, every movement a reminder of discipline and control. Before getting inside, he turned one last time, his voice carrying weight that silenced the crowd. "Power is nothing without integrity," he said. The words lingered in the air, striking harder than any punch could. The crowd knew they were hearing more than just a statement. It was a truth carved from experience, a warning meant for everyone watching. Behind him, the disgraced officers were being read their rights, their heads hanging low as the reality of job loss, exposure, and criminal charges sank in. Their arrogance had turned to shame, their abuse of power destroyed by the very system they tried to corrupt. Chuck opened his car door and sat inside, his composure unshaken, as though the storm had never touched him. The people gathered knew they had witnessed something unforgettable, justice restored in its purest form. Now the question rests with the audience. What would you have done if you witnessed this corruption?